Today, press freedom under attack around the world. Authoritarian regimes crack down on reporters, where they can go, who they can speak to, and what issues they can report. A new press index says a cycle of fear is eroding press freedom around the world and in America. We will discuss what is fueling the rising hate and distrust of journalists and how it impacts what you read, see, and you hear. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. May 3rd is World Press Freedom Day, but based on the trends that we are seeing around the world, it does not look good for reporters. The latest World Press Freedom Index shows a steady decline of what we call a free press, including right here in the United States, where reporting critical to some in high office is sometimes called fake news. Plugged In's Elizabeth Chernoff reports the deaths and dangers journalists endured in 2018.
In April, an Islamic State suicide bomber in Afghanistan, posing as a member of the media, killed 26 people, including 9 journalists who were rushing to the scene following the initial explosion. In June, a gunman walked into a Maryland newsroom and opened fire, killing 5 local newspaper staffers. And in October, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside a Saudi consulate in Turkey. From kidnappings and murders to imprisonment, the threat to journalists is on the rise in what experts say is an increasingly alarming trend.
Journalists in democracies are increasingly at threat, and journalists in countries not in conflict are still paying the ultimate price for their reporting.
According to Reporters Without Borders, at least 63 professional journalists were killed in 2018. The top 3 deadliest countries for journalists are Afghanistan, Syria, and Mexico, according to the report. But the attacks aren't limited to killings. The jailing of journalists is also on the rise. The Committee to Protect Journalists says China, Turkey, and Egypt are responsible for more than half of the total number of imprisonments. Officials cited cases like the one in Myanmar, which sentenced 2 Reuters journalists to 7 years in prison this year.
They uncovered a war crime, an atrocity. And for that, they were set up by the police, accused of having stolen documents, which they did not. And now, in a mockery of judicial process, they have been thrown in jail. Those are exactly the kinds of journalists in their own country reporting on their governments that are running into trouble.
You're creating violence by your questions. You are creating you. And also, a lot of the reporters are creating violence by not writing the truth. The fake news is creating violence.
In the U.S., the president's heated anti-media rhetoric is setting an example for other leaders who want to attack the press, experts say.
By calling them fake news, he's saying they're illegitimate. By saying that they're failing, he's saying they're on the wrong side of history. And by saying that they're the enemy of the people, he is saying that I am the people. If they're my enemy, if they criticize me, they're really criticizing you.
Public trust in the American press is at an all-time low in what some say is a broader illustration of an overall global decline of press freedom. But there are some positive signs of change, too. In Ethiopia, which is undergoing democratic reforms implemented by the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, no journalists are reported jailed for the first time in 14 years. And that's not all.
Well, we have seen some changes in the regimes in certain countries like Ecuador, South Korea, the Gambia, which have accounted for some of improvements in our World Press Freedom Index.
Yet, as journalists continue their work around the world, the latest reports signal they will be doing so in an increasingly difficult and risky environment. Elizabeth Chernoff, VOA News, Washington.
And the ability of reporters to question those in power is not getting better. With more on the best and worst countries for journalists, here's Plugged In's Mil Arcega.
Of the 180 countries in the list, the worst offenders remain unchanged. Turkmenistan still occupies the bottom slot, followed by North Korea, Eritrea, China, and Vietnam. The highest-ranked countries for press freedoms are at number 1, Norway, followed by Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Some of the notable declines, though, include the United States and the Americas. The U.S. fell 3 slots and now ranks 48th in the world. In comparison, Canada was unchanged at 18th place. Mexico improved slightly, up 3 slots at 144. Venezuela and Argentina declined by 5, putting Venezuela in 148th place, and Argentina fell to 57.
Joining us to explain why press freedom is important is a frequent contributor to our show, Robert Mahoney. He is Deputy Executive Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. He has worked as a reporter and was once bureau chief and editor at Reuters International. He has written extensively on press freedom and has led CPJ missions to global hotspots from Iraq to Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Good morning.
Just as an overview for people who are watching, because we have an audience around the world, we have a constitution with free press here in the United States, but in general, how important is free press to the world?
It's the underpinning of democracy, and it's the journalists are really on the front lines of holding governments accountable and providing transparency. What is happening to people's rights, how their tax money is spent. And without journalists, governments can implement policies which restrict those rights, and corruption thrives.
Is there any way to reconcile? In our first 2 reports, it said that the 3 most dangerous places for reporters is Iraq, Syria, and Mexico. Yet on the index of press freedom, Mexico has now risen to a better position. It is improving, yet it's so profoundly dangerous for journalists. Can you reconcile that?
Well, I think we at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we don't publish that index. I think the thing for me is that in Mexico you have the deliberate murder by criminal gangs and narco traffickers of journalists who are trying to report on corruption and how the cartels have infiltrated particularly state government and undermined the rule of law outside of Mexico City in a way that makes it extremely difficult to be an investigative journalist there. You contrast that against what's happening in war zones or conflict zones such as Iraq or Syria, where a lot of journalists are on the front lines, are caught in bombings and the rest of it. So you have a difference between targeted murder in a country like Mexico and conflict reporting in many of the Middle East countries.
Is there some correlation for the increased danger or the decline in safety or protection or press freedoms around the world? Is there some correlation to social media or not? Is it helping or hurting?
Social media is one of those things that I suppose we could call it a dual-use technology. When it first came out, it enabled a lot of journalists and bloggers, particularly those in restricted countries, to be able to publish. They could bypass the normal channels that were controlled by the government. But governments are now using social media against journalists to control speech and to control information. And there's a lot of pollution of the information pool on social media. This is something that we as journalists are grappling with. It's something that the companies that provide these platforms are also looking at. And I think what happens is that rumors rather than news can spread incredibly quickly on social media, and we have seen the physical consequences of that, particularly in the subcontinent where there have been people killed in India and Sri Lanka because of rumors that are spread, which actually underlines the need for journalists, because journalists check out rumors and try to put out facts on social media. But at the moment we have, as I said, a kind of a pollution of the information system on social media, which we all need to grapple with.
How does sort of the expanding definition of journalists impact this? I mean, you have the journalists or the conventional, traditional journalists, but then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have a blogger, and even beyond that, you might have an activist blogger with an axe to grind, for instance, which may be confused with the conventional journalists.
Yeah, that's a big problem, and we at the Committee to Protect Journalists take a very common sense approach to this and look at people who are what I would say performing acts of journalism. So we're looking at what people do and not as how they self-identify. A few years ago, it was easy to be a journalist. You worked for a recognized news outlet. You had a press card. Those days are gone. So we're looking at who is doing reporting, who is consistently gathering news and publishing it, and doing acts of journalism, and we would regard those people as journalists, as opposed to people who are taking part in demonstrations and photographing it. Those are more activists or protesters.
So even someone like in the Sudanese demonstration protests in Khartoum recently, if they were every day blogging and taking pictures and putting them up on the internet, for instance, because of the media being shut down there, they would not be considered journalists, or they are?
I think that what they're doing is journalism. The big difference is in the action rather than the label, because governments make no distinction. We saw this with the uprisings in the Arab world in 2011 onwards, where people who had never been journalists, suddenly they were the only ones who could document what was going on. They were so appalled by the violence against the protests that they saw that every day they went out, they started to film or they started to write about what they saw. And governments went after them. Governments tried to control them and actually jailed and killed many of them. So I would regard what they were doing as journalism, even though it wouldn't fit in with the traditional, particularly professional definitions that we have been used to.
In the 30 seconds we have left, any tip for news organizations how to protect their journalists, especially when they're in very dangerous places?
Yeah, absolutely. They need to. Those that don't already do it need to provide the people working for them with information about how to plan for a dangerous assignment. They need to be given the protective equipment, flak jackets, helmets, etc. if they're going to a place where they need that, and they need to be able to have insurance and medical care if they are injured, because a lot of the people that we rely on now for our news are freelancers, people without much money who don't work for big news organizations, and they often don't have the monetary resources to be able to protect themselves like those who work for big news organizations do.
Robert Mahoney, CPJ Deputy Executive Director, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
A stark example of the declining state of press freedom around the world is in the Philippines. And once again, here's Plugged In's Mil Arcega.
Once regarded as a country with one of the greatest press freedoms in Asia, the Philippines under President Rodrigo Duterte currently ranks 134 on the press freedom list. Rappler.com, one of the most popular news websites in the country, has become the target of an online harassment campaign for its critical reporting of the president's policies, including his use of extrajudicial killings, giving local police the authority to kill thousands of drug dealers without the benefit of a trial. Duterte has labeled Rappler fake news and has filed numerous lawsuits against the publication, accusing its reporters of libel and claiming the company violated a constitutional ban on foreign ownership. The government has arrested Rappler's co-founder and executive editor, Maria Ressa, at least twice in the last 2 months, a tactic media watchdogs say is meant to intimidate the president's critics.
Besides her 30 years of reporting, Maria Ressa is also CEO and executive editor of Rappler.com. She's won numerous awards for her reports and was recently named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. She was formerly CNN's bureau chief in Manila and Jakarta. She joins us live via Skype from Manila, Philippines. Nice to talk to you.
Good to speak with you, Greta.
The world's been pretty much following what's going on with Rappler, or at least the journalism world, Rappler in the Philippines. But let me start with the Philippines. Does it have in its constitution free press?
Yeah, absolutely. The Constitution in the Philippines, 1987 Constitution, is fashioned after the United States. So not only do we have similar provisions, we have a Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press are enshrined in it.
So why are you banned? Why is Rappler banned from covering the president of the Philippines?
It's been 14 months that Rappler has been banned, not just in the palace, but across the country in any private event, the whim of the president. And that's part of the reason that we've actually filed a case at the Supreme Court. It's a test case, press freedom case, and just yesterday there was an intervention by 41 other journalists from other news groups that normally compete with each other. This is the first time that journalists are coming together to make sure that these kinds of creeping bans are stopped and that the executive is held accountable.
Is there any doubt that Rappler's a news organization? Give us a little history. How long has it been around? What does Rappler do?
Rappler, there is no doubt that Rappler is a news organization. The government has accredited us. We are accredited at the palace until the president whimsically decided to ban our reporter. We do investigative stories. We started a startup 7 years ago in 2012, and oh my gosh, if you ask me for the elevator pitch for Rappler, we build communities of action. We fuse technology and journalism together to build communities. I think where we differ from traditional news groups is that we use technology to build communities. So, for example, in the question you had earlier, in our experience, social media, technology, social media platforms play a key role in the rollback of democracy in many countries around the world, and the Philippines is a great case study of that. The kind of exponential attacks against me, against Rappler, you're talking about as much as 90 hate messages per hour. These are coordinated, and we've shown how they are directly related to the palace, to government, pro-government supporters, proxies, and the government itself.
I suppose I was trying to figure out what President Duterte was doing, how he was getting around it. And in reading the Constitution, it says no law shall be enacted to step on basically press freedom. I suspect that what he is saying is that no law has been enacted or is. He's just on his personal whim or whatever. He's just banning you. And is that how he's getting around that constitutional provision?
That's exactly how. Nothing is written. And, there are many things that have happened that way. For example, the burial of Ferdinand Marcos that happened without anything written. It's the way our president today, President Duterte, gets around very tricky issues of the Constitution.
Now, so he's banned Rappler, banned you. Is there physical danger also involved? I'm not asking that to take away from the obvious, issue about stepping on free press. But is there a physical danger for any of you?
You never know. We know around the world that online violence leads to real world violence. And so we've increased security in Rappler. But I think, I want to bring up that this kind of weaponization of social media going bottom up with exponential attacks is coupled with the government also coming top down. In July 2017, in his State of the Nation address, President Duterte charged Rappler. Within a week, we had our first investigation in cases. If you look in the last 14 months, the Philippine government has filed 11 cases against us. In 2 months, I've had to post bail 8 times. And in just 5 weeks, I was arrested twice and detained once. That is an extreme erosion of our freedoms.
Given the history of President Duterte, and we know a little bit about him, I found a little bit about him, if the Supreme Court should rule in your favor, with Rappler in your favor, is President Duterte likely to take the cue from the Supreme Court and follow them, or is he going to be dismissive and not follow? What's your prediction?
We have a veneer of rule of law, and if the Supreme Court were to first take up the case and then rule against it, there would be a veneer of following it, in the same way that there's a veneer of due process in these numerous cases that have been filed against us. But the reality is that we almost have a captured system, right? So it's up to the Philippine judiciary to prove its independence, and that's part of what we're asking for in going through this process.
Are the other news organizations, I realize there are 41 that have come out in favor of you for the Supreme Court thing, but are there news organizations in the Philippines putting this on their front page and constantly standing, in solidarity with Rappler every single day so the pressure's on?
Not always, but increasingly so. Just last week, the presidential palace, the spokesman, actually released what they call a matrix of, and the matrix are supposed coup plotters, and these are news organizations, independent news organizations. Just today, the Secretary Panelo, our presidential spokesman, said that the president doesn't need evidence to actually release these coup plotters, right? Which is false. This is laying the ground for more attacks against the media. And what we're asking for is, that this kind of death by 1,000 cuts, that there be some accountability. I think what you're seeing is really this kind of slow erosion, and because it's slow, coupled with the violence that comes from the drug war. You're talking about, the UN estimates a death toll from July 2016 of 27,000 people. That's a lot. So it creates this climate of fear that makes it difficult to actually speak out. There are risks to speaking out.
Well, we're going to be following this, Maria. We have been following it, and good luck. Maria Ressa, Rappler's CEO. Nice to see you. Ms. Ressa's battles with authorities is just one of many around the world. Plugged In has also been following the case of 2 Reuters reporters who were jailed in Myanmar in 2017. Walon and Jaw So U were arrested while investigating mass graves of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. The journalists have unsuccessfully appealed their case several times through Myanmar's courts. And in April, Myanmar's highest court, their Supreme Court, rejected their final appeal and upheld their 7-year sentence. Reuters and human rights groups worldwide have expressed extreme disappointment in the High Court's decision. But the efforts of these two Reuters reporters to uncover the truth has not gone unnoticed. The two reporters were recently awarded the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting. Reuters has vowed to continue the fight to free Walon and Jaw So U. For more on that effort, I'm joined via Skype by Reuters editor-in-chief Stephen J. Adler, who is in New York. He's vice chairman of the board of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. He's a member of the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Good afternoon, sir. And tell me, what is the next step? If the High Court has ruled against those two Reuters reporters, what possibly can be next? Would that be to appeal to Aung San Suu Kyi?
Thanks, Greta, for continuing to be concerned about this issue. They've been in prison for 506 days now for just reporting the truth. You may have seen that over the past few weeks, Myanmar has freed actually thousands of prisoners through pardons. And the most obvious and likely next step would be a pardon for Walon and Jaw So U. So we're certainly very much hoping that that happens. It's time for them to be free. This isn't good for Myanmar. It isn't good for free press. Aung San Suu Kyi has expressed support in the past for human rights and for free press, and pardoning them would be the best way to show that there's a commitment there to that.
Well, if there's any doubt to anybody watching, I think it's an important fact to point out that a police officer testified at their trial that the two were set up, which is not an insignificant fact.
Yes, and in fact, that police officer was then arrested and imprisoned for violating police rules. But the case was clearly a setup. It was clear in every aspect. One of the police witnesses said he had had notes of the arrest, but he had burned his notes. Another one came in with writing on the side of his hand so he could remember what to say. A third one came in and said that they were instructed to set up our reporters. There's no question that they were arrested because they were reporting on this massacre. In fact, their interrogation, which was quite a brutal interrogation, their interrogation focused entirely on their coverage of that case. It had nothing to do with so-called official secrets. And as you know, the way they were set up is that they were invited essentially to a restaurant to meet with some police officers who said they wanted to talk to them. They were handed a rolled-up newspaper that apparently had some documents in it and told not to open it. They walked outside, and they were immediately surrounded and arrested. So this was just a blatant setup, and the entire trial was based on that setup. So I think everybody in the world knows that they're not guilty. The question is, can we get them out? And that is what we're working on.
We followed it here at Voice of America and here specifically on Plugged In many times, and I've been disheartened by the American media not putting a bigger spotlight on the issue of these two Reuters reporters in particular. Is the American media, does it have, if it does put its spotlight on it, is it likely to have any influence in Myanmar?
Well, first of all, I'd say there has been very strong support, both from the media and from world leaders, from the Pope, from the UN General Secretary, from representatives of countries all over the world. And there's been a lot of press coverage, and I think the U.S. press has been quite generous in providing space to me.
You're nicer about it than I am, because
others.
You know what? You're nicer about it than I am, because every single day they could be tweeting about it. Wouldn't cost a dime and it'd take 5 seconds. Right. I think you're a gentleman, because I don't agree with you on that.
Okay, fair enough. 506 days is very challenging. So you know as well as I do that news cycles move very quickly, and maintaining attention is very difficult. So at key junctures, when there's an arrest, when there's a conviction, when there's a sentence, you get a lot of attention. And I agree with you, the challenge is in the in-between times, keeping up that groundswell of support. But I think it's important that there be solidarity around issues like this, and World Press Freedom Day is another opportunity to pay attention to it. I think at the end of the day, the issue really is, does Aung San Suu Kyi and the Myanmar government understand how important it is to reestablish ties with the world community, to reestablish its reputation for democratizing, for caring about human rights, for caring about press freedom. And it's they who really have to act here. And I think one of the challenges has been a lot of the Western community just has not been that influential, although they have tried. But I think the efforts are continuing and have to continue. Clearly, you don't want to forget people who are sitting in insane prison in Yangon for 506 days just because they did good, honest, and fair reporting. There's been no challenge to the accuracy of their reporting. And as you say, it has won a Pulitzer Prize because it was so outstanding.
And as an aside, before I'll take the last word on this, is that one of the impacts on this is that other reporters have not been able to get into the Rakhine State to investigate these atrocities or any other atrocities. So it's been very effective to discourage other news sources or reporters to even to risk their lives to go in there, understandably so.
Yes, but it is possible to report there. You can report from Bangladesh. You can use
I've
sources.
Been there.
And yes, and there are people there. The families of the people who were massacred. We found all of them in Cox's Bazar, and we interviewed all of them. So we learned much more about the individuals. So often this stuff is impersonal, and we wanted to personalize it. Tell you these are real people.
And with that, I got to go. But I agree with you. Thank you very much for joining us, Stephen Adler, Reuters editor-in-chief. As you can imagine, press freedom is an issue we care deeply about here at the Voice of America. And VOA recently embarked on an effort to expand press freedom around the world. To tell us more about that initiative, we are joined by VOA Director Amanda Bennett. Thank you for joining us. Nice to see you, Amanda.
Hey, thank you, Greta.
What is this initiative that we're doing here?
So press freedom is actually at the core of what VOA is and what it does. We're not only the only source of credible information for a good part of the world, we also, for the good part of the world, represent the very idea that a free press can exist. So our initiative is designed to help kind of maximize that mission that we have. And so we're going to be really focusing, you mentioned with Steve Adler, on keeping the spotlight on various places. We're going to be focusing on telling more stories about press freedom around the world, both the challenges to press freedom, but we're also going to try and educate people on things like, for example, how does a country go from a free press to a not free press? What happens along the way? How do people operate inside an area where it's not free? So we'll be covering those stories a lot more than we have been before.
You know, we are so lucky. It's not perfect here in the United States, and I don't pretend that. I mean, I've locked horns with governments for the last 25 years, but the value of having that constitutional right to free press, most countries don't have that. Of course, Philippines has it, but it's not enforced. But most countries don't have that.
Well, and that's the difference between us and a lot of the other countries, which is the rule of law. The rule of law exists, and it's by and large respected, and that makes a huge difference between us and the rest of the world. For example, even though Voice of America is funded by the U.S. government, we have laws that keep us separate. So we are truly an independent voice.
The government has to leave us alone.
They have to leave us alone. They can't direct what we can cover, and that's different between us and other state-owned broadcasts like the Russian state broadcasters.
So what can VOA do to help journalists around the world? I mean, we got these two Reuters journalists. I guess we can use the spotlight here on our show. But I mean, there's so many journalists. Mexico, they're getting killed. Syria and Afghanistan, it's dangerous. I mean, what do you tell the journalists here?
Well, that's one of the things that we're hoping to focus on with this show, which is bringing a spotlight to the journalists in trouble, but also trying to bring out the kinds of things that restrict a free press. Because I don't think people around the world really know the extent to which, I mean, listening to Maria Ressler, I mean, the fact that governments use taxation, they use financial threats, they use threats to relatives. So making that clear to people around the world, I think, is one of the best things we can do.
Well, it's shocking. I'm disappointed in the American media. Because, I'm proud of Voice of America, what it does in putting the spotlight here. And I tip my hat to my colleagues. But I think the American media could spend a little more time focusing on the issues around the world of so many journalists, because it does impact us back here in the United States.
So that's one of the things that we think we can use our patch for, is that this is who we are and what we're known for around the world. So we're going to try and amplify that a bit.
Okay. Amanda, thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have here for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.